Once upon a time, in a small town lived a man named Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson was a talented baker and loved making the most delicious cakes, pastries and breads. He had a small shop on the riverside of the city. His shop was very famous for making excellent baked pastries and cream breads. Mr. Johnson used to get up early in the morning before sunrise and go to his kitchen to prepare flour for making his pastries and other dishes. Mr. Johnson takes great care in his work, using premium ingredients to create his dishes and handcrafting all of his dishes with the utmost care. By the time any of the townspeople woke up to start their day, Mr. Johnson's oven was already ready to prepare the most delicious pastries. The aroma of his pastries spread across the street and attracted even the most stubborn neighbors to his bakery. But despite his passion for baking and his recipes becoming more delicious, Mr. Johnson's business was not doing as well as he hoped. The city was small, and there were very few customers. Moreover, it was winter time and there was a lot of snowfall, due to which there were no tourists in their city, and the roads were also covered with snow, and due to which all the roads in and out of the city were closed. People had no work, and it was becoming difficult for them to survive without work. So it was not unusual for someone to come into a shop, look longingly at all the attractive dishes on display, and then leave without buying anything. It was a common weekday morning. Mr. Johnson was sitting on the couch, looking at a place, and thinking about his shop, when Mrs. Johnson came in the door from her work. And she saw Mr. Johnson sitting sadly on the sofa, and she knew that her husband was worried about something. And to find out what her husband was worried about, she went up to him and said softly, "Mr. Johnson, you seem very worried. What happened?" Mr. Johnson sighs heavily before saying anything to his wife. "It's just, the bakery isn't doing too well these days," he said wearily, rubbing his temples. "There are no sales in our store, and I don't know what to do," Mr. Johnson said. Mrs. Johnson nodded, understanding what her husband meant. Both of them had worked tirelessly to build their business, but this time, times were tough, and it seemed there was no way out. "I can understand why you're so worried," she told him lovingly. "But don't worry, we will find some solutions together, as we always do," Mrs. Johnson said. Mr. Johnson couldn't help but reminisce about his childhood and the days when the bakery was full and bustling. As a child, he grew up working with his father in a bakery. He remembered the sound of the mixer, the smell of fresh bread, and the happy chatter of customers. But now, as he looked around the bakery, he could see that things had changed. There were only a few customers at a time, and the silence of the place was almost deafening. He was working harder than before, but the number of customers coming to the shop was not increasing. The shop, which used to be so bustling, is now quiet. The number of customers was decreasing day by day. He remembered his parents and how hard they worked to make the bakery a success. They put everything they had into the business and saw it grow and prosper over the years. His parents were always his role models, and he always aspired to be like them. But now, as Mr. Johnson looks around the bakery, he begins to feel as if he has let his parents down. The shop which his parents had built, with so much hard work and love, he could not take it forward. He turned to his wife, who was sitting across from him, and said with a sad face, "I remember when this place was full of life and customers. And now, it's completely empty." "I know," his wife said consolingly. "But we can't dwell on the past. We need to focus on what we can do now to make things better for the future." "I know you're right," Mr. Johnson nodded, wiping away tears. "But it's hard to see a store we built so lovingly fall apart. They both sat quietly for a moment, looking around the bakery, lost in thought. But then, Mr. Johnson's eyes lit up, and a small smile appeared on his face. "I know what we can do," he said, feeling a ray of hope. "We can start offering more unique and creative products, something that differentiates us from the competition." His wife smiled at the excitement in his eyes. "That's a good idea," she said. "And who knows, maybe we'll get this place back to the way it was." Both of them had to brainstorm ideas for new and creative products that would attract more customers. Mr. Johnson also took some online baking classes to learn new recipes. As the days pass, Mr. Johnson tries different marketing strategies to attract more customers. He puts up signs around town, places ads in the local newspaper, and even offers discounts to loyal customers. And after putting in all his efforts, more customers started coming to his shop and enjoying some of Mr. Johnson's delicious breads and pastries, but unfortunately, it didn't help his business much. Despite customer satisfaction, declining sales due to low tourist attractions and no large pastry orders remain a problem for Mr. Johnson's bakery. And on one of those particularly long days, when Mr. Johnson's shop was empty and his spirits were low, he stopped his work and sat down at a table with a mug of coffee. He closed his eyes and breathed in the aroma of fresh bread and butter, which made him feel warm and cozy. And then he eats a bite of whatever he cooked that day, maybe a buttery croissant or a puffed muffin. And something magical happens. The flavors would dance on his tongue, and they would melt in his mouth, and for a moment everything else would disappear. And as he was trying to overcome his grief and trying out his cooking magic, a magic indeed happened in his life. A young couple came to the door of his bakery. They were walking outside, taking in the sights of the city, when the smell of baking drew them inside. They walked inside the bakery, and they walked slowly around the shop, admiring the rows of breads, the racks of cookies, the gleaming frosting on the cakes. And then they stopped in front of cinnamon rolls. "Do you make these fresh?" the woman asked, pointing towards the roll with a delicate finger. "Every morning," Mr. Johnson said, he said proudly. Young couple each bought a cinnamon roll, and they ate a cinnamon roll made by Mr. Johnson for the first time. Their eyes widened in surprise, and their faces lit up with joy as they ate the cinnamon rolls. They nodded at each other, clearly impressed by what they were tasting. Mr. Johnson felt a spark of joy in his chest. That's what it was all about, the simple joy of creating something that brings joy to others. "Can we get a dozen to take home?" the man asked, turning to Mr. Johnson with a smile. Mr. Johnson's heart began to beat faster. He wondered if this could be possible. An actual order of a full dozen of something? It was like a small miracle. He nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I can pack as many as you want," said Mr. Johnson. From that day on, the young couple became regular customers, stopping by every week to pick up a dozen cinnamon rolls to share with their friends and family. Soon word spread among the locals about Mr. Johnson's delicious pastries and his shop. One day Mr. Johnson had just finished cleaning after the last customer had left, when the bell above the door rang again. He turned back to see one of his regular customer, Mrs. Jenkins, walking in with a big smile on her face. "Hey, Mr. Johnson," she called. "How is your business going?" Mr. Johnson smiled at her. "Oh, everything's going well, and now I've got a lot of customers, you know," he replied, moving closer to the counter. "Mrs. Jenkins, what can I get you today?" Mr. Johnson said. Mrs. Jenkins smiled at him. "It's nice to see that your shop is doing well, but actually, I came here today to place a large order for the church festival sale next month, she said, taking out a list from her purse. We're hoping to raise a lot of money this year, and everyone always loves your pastries. Mr. Johnson was very happy to see such a big order. Wow, that's great news, he said while looking at the list. How many pastries are we talking about here? Mrs. Jenkins shrugged. Oh, about 100 or so, she replied casually. Mr. Johnson's eyes widened in surprise. 100 pastries? This was much more than he usually earned in a day. But he was eager to please Mrs. Jenkins and help make the festival sale a success. Sure, I can do that, he said confidently, and made up his mind to start cooking early in the morning. The next day, Mr. Johnson woke up very early and was eager to begin work on his largest order yet. He preheated the oven and began mixing the ingredients and rolling out the dough. But just as he was about to put the first batch of pastries in the oven, something went wrong. There was a loud cracking sound, and a cloud of smoke came out of the oven. He checked the oven and immediately realized that his oven was broken. Mr. Johnson was heartbroken and panicked and tried to call a repairman, but they were all booked for that day. Frustrated, he even contacted his competitors to see if he could use their ovens, but to no avail. Panicked, he sent a message to Mrs. Jenkins to explain his situation and apologize that he could not fulfill her order. And just as Mr. Johnson was feeling heartbroken and sad, he received a message from Mrs. Jenkins. And he was very surprised to see Mrs. Jenkins's sympathetic message. As she said, the church group understands and they don't want him to feel bad. And then she said something Mr. Johnson will never forget: we'll still pay you for your time and materials, whether we get any pastries or not. Mr. Johnson had tears in his eyes as he read her message. He couldn't believe how kind the church group was, especially after he had failed them so badly. He thanked them profusely and promised to compensate them in any way he could. Over the next few days, Mr. Johnson worked hard to fix his oven. He sought help from friends and family who knew how to repair appliances, and eventually he was able to obtain the parts he needed for his oven. And after getting his oven fixed, he spent long hours in his bakery and worked hard to complete his delayed orders. And through it all, he felt deeply grateful for the kindness that Mrs. Jenkins and the church group showed him. When Mrs. Jenkins came to collect her pastries a week later, Mr. Johnson couldn't help but smile from ear to ear. He was very proud of the huge box of pastries he made for Mrs. Jenkins: cinnamon rolls, fruit tarts, chocolate croissants, and more. And he was very grateful for the second chance he was given. "Thank you for being so understanding," he said, handing over the box. "I really appreciate it. And if you ever need anything else, please let me know," Mr. Johnson said, smiling. Mrs. Jenkins smiled warmly at him. "Of course," she said. "We're always happy to support a local business like yours. And I am a long-time customer of yours, too," Mrs. Jenkins said to Mr. Johnson. And both smiled, looking at each other. And as Mrs. Jenkins walked out the door, Mr. Johnson knew he had gained not only a customer, but a true friend. Mr. Johnson could not help but be overwhelmed with joy. And as he looked back, he saw that his wife and child were headed towards the bakery, and after a long day he was very happy to see his family. And he welcomed them with a warm smile on his face. "Hey guys," he called while hugging both of them. "How was your morning?" "Very nice," his wife said, smiling as she looked around the bakery. "Looks like business is going well," she said, nodding toward the tray of pastries on the counter. Mr. Johnson smiled with satisfaction. Yes, it's going very well, and I've been quite busy lately with bakery work, he said, rolling up his arm. But I like working all day at bakery. And I love making something that makes people happy. Mr. Johnson said with a warm smile on his face. His child tugged at his sleeve, pointing to a tray of cookies. Can I have one, Dad? She asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. Mr. Johnson laughed and handed her a cookie. Of course you can, he said, caressing her hair. But just one for now, okay? As he watched his family enjoy the pastries, Mr. Johnson couldn't help but be grateful for everything they had. He had a thriving business, a supportive community, and a loving family to share it all with. And when he looked out the window, at the sunny day outside, he knew that no matter what challenges he faced, he would always find joy in the simple things, like a warm cinnamon roll, a customer's smile, and the people who loved him and his family.